It began in silence. A calm ocean stretched to the horizon, its endless surface broken only by slow swells rolling under the morning light of May 1942. The Coral Sea, so blue, so wide, so deceptively peaceful. Yet beneath that quiet lay a moment when the fate of nations would shift. By early 1942, the Pacific had turned into an empire of conquest. From Pearl Harbor to Singapore, from the Philippines to the Dutch East Indies, Japan's expansion had seemed unstoppable. Its fleets sailed freely, its armies advanced through island chains once thought unreachable. To the south lay Australia, isolated, threatened, and vital to any hope of resisting Japan's dominance. Tokyo's high command planned to take Port Moresby in Papua New Guinea. The capture of that base would sever supply lines between the United States and Australia, tighten Japan's defensive perimeter, and place northern Australia within striking range. It was a bold design meant to end Allied counteroffensives before they could begin. But Japan did not know its intentions were already compromised. In back rooms in Melbourne and Pearl Harbor, Allied cryptographers had begun to penetrate the veil of Japanese naval codes. Every intercepted message, every fragment of traffic, slowly revealed the outline of a massive operation moving southward. American and Australian intelligence officers pieced together what seemed impossible only months earlier: the exact timing and objective of a major Japanese thrust toward the Coral Sea. At Pearl Harbor, Admiral Chester W. Nimitz weighed those decoded fragments carefully. At sea, Rear Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher received his orders: intercept the Japanese invasion force before it reached Port Moresby. Two U.S. carrier groups, Task Force 11, built around USS Lexington, and Task Force 17, centered on USS Yorktown, were dispatched to the Coral Sea. From Australia came a crucial addition: cruisers HMAS Australia and HMAS Hobart joined the task group under Rear Admiral John Crace, forming a combined Allied shield. The men who sailed north from Sydney and Pearl Harbor knew little of the grand design. They saw only the endless ocean, the narrow bunks, and the sense that something vast and dangerous was waiting beyond the horizon. Many were young, barely 20, yet carried the weight of a continent's hopes. On board HMAS Hobart, Petty Officer Roy Scribner later remembered the moment the Allied fleets came together. "We joined the Americans, and the sight was something. Carrier decks bristling with planes, cruisers, and destroyers in tight formation. It was magnificent and terrifying. Everyone knew this was for real. The combined fleet pushed east, the decks alive with preparation. Aircraft mechanics worked through the night, tightening bolts, loading torpedoes, adjusting fuel mixtures. Pilots checked maps under red light, memorizing the shapes of islands they had never seen. Radio silence cloaked the sea. Each captain relied on dead reckoning, celestial fixes, and faith in their navigators. Across the Pacific, the Japanese plan unfolded. Two main groups moved toward their targets: the Port Moresby invasion convoy under Admiral Goto, covered by the light carrier Shoho, and the striking force of fleet carriers Shokaku and Zuokaku, commanded by Admiral Takeo Takagi. Their mission was simple: protect the invasion, destroy any Allied force that appeared. The stage was set for a kind of battle never fought before. Two opposing fleets would engage without ever seeing one another. The ocean itself would become the battlefield, with aircraft as the only weapons that could reach across the horizon. The age of carrier warfare had arrived. The first encounter came quickly. On May 3rd, Japanese troops landed at Tulagi in the Solomon Islands, establishing a seaplane base to guard the eastern flank of the invasion route. Fletcher, still hundreds of miles away, reacted at once. The next morning, planes from USS Yorktown streaked northward under low clouds, descended on Tulagi, and struck hard. In minutes, several Japanese minesweepers and support vessels were burning. It was a small victory, but it signaled to both sides that the Coral Sea would not be taken quietly. For the next 2 days, the fleet searched blindly. Scouting aircraft fanned out in great arcs, hundreds of miles long, reporting only empty water and weather fronts. Every sighting report was a decision point. Was that a carrier, a transport, a mirage? Every delay risked fuel shortages and surprise attack. On May 5th, Task Force 17 and Task Force 11 joined east of the Louisiade Archipelago. The great carriers Lexington and Yorktown now sailed together. Below decks, sailors felt the ship's subtle roll as aircraft were lifted to the flight deck. Above, lookouts scanned the sky for the smallest speck that might spell danger. Night brought no rest. Red lights glowed in the ready rooms as pilots received briefings. Weather reports spoke of scattered clouds and rising humidity, the kind of conditions that could hide entire squadrons. Somewhere out there, beyond the horizon, Japanese carriers were doing the same. At dawn on May 7th, the search intensified. Fletcher divided his forces, sending Admiral Crace's Australian-American surface group westward to block the Jamard Passage, the narrow corridor through which the invasion convoy must pass. Crace's cruisers and destroyers steamed ahead without carrier protection, aware they might soon face Japanese bombers alone. In mid-morning, the tension broke. A U.S. reconnaissance pilot sighted a Japanese group north of Misima Island. 2 carriers and several escorts, he reported. Fletcher seized the moment and launched a full strike from Yorktown and Lexington. At the same time, Japanese scouts reported American ships to their south. Each side believed it had found the enemy's main force. Each launched its attack. The American planes found their target first. What they saw was not the great carriers Shokaku or Zukaku, but the smaller Shoho covering the invasion convoy. At 11 a.m., the sky above the light carrier filled with diving bombers and torpedo planes. Bombs tore through her decks, torpedoes struck her hull, and within minutes, Shoho was burning from bow to stern. Lieutenant Commander Robert E. Dixon radioed the words that became legend. "Scratch one flat top." Cheers erupted in ready rooms aboard Lexington and Yorktown. The first Japanese carrier of the war had been sunk. But the triumph was brief. Far to the south, the destroyer USS Sims and the oiler USS Neosho, detached to refuel the carriers, were spotted by Japanese aircraft searching for the main U.S. fleet. Mistaking them for carriers, Japanese dive bombers descended in waves. Sims fought back furiously, her anti-aircraft guns blazing, but she was overwhelmed. A series of direct hits broke her in two. She sank within minutes. Neosho was left burning and adrift. Survivors clung to wreckage as oil spread across the sea. Fireman Third Class George Ernst, one of the few rescued days later, would say quietly, "The loss was too great, but we stopped them from reaching Australia." Everyone on Sims fought to the last shell. For the men adrift from Neosho, the hours stretched into days. Sun and salt scoured their skin. Thirst became torment. Some slipped beneath the waves without a sound. When rescue finally came, many were too weak to speak. The following morning, May 8th, would decide the battle. Both fleets, still unseen to one another, launched their full air groups at dawn. American scouts from Yorktown found the Japanese carriers at 10 a.m. The sea below them shimmered, revealing 2 silhouettes, Shokaku and Zuikaku. From high altitude, the dauntless dive bombers began their descent. The scream of wind and the thud of anti-aircraft bursts filled the cockpits. Bombs struck Shokaku's forward flight deck, ripping open the hangars, scattering burning aircraft across her bow. Flames leapt skyward, yet she survived, battered but afloat. Moments later, the Japanese counterattack arrived over the American carriers. Radar operators on Lexington tracked them at 70 miles. Wildcats launched to intercept but could not stop every torpedo plane. 2 torpedoes slammed into Lexington's port side. Another series of bombs followed. At first, she seemed to hold steady. Then below decks, aviation fuel lines ruptured. The fumes ignited. Captain Frederick C. Sherman ordered firefighting crews below. Men carried hoses through smoke-filled corridors, but secondary explosions rolled through the ship. By afternoon, the great carrier was dying. Sherman finally gave the order to abandon ship. Boats crowded with survivors pulled away as the flames consumed her. Over 200 men were lost. Pharmacist mate Virgil Weeks, working below during the inferno, treated the burned until he could no longer stand. A shipmate later wrote, "He kept moving through the smoke, giving morphine, bandaging wounds, pushing men toward ladders." He didn't stop. The rest of the fleet withdrew southward. Yorktown was damaged but still operational. Shokaku limped away under escort. Zukaku had escaped damage but had lost most of her air group. Both sides claimed victory, yet the outcome was something new. Japan's advance had been checked. For the first time since December 1941, the Imperial Japanese Navy had failed to achieve its objective. The Port Moresby invasion was cancelled. The strategic line protecting Australia held firm. In numerical terms, the losses seemed balanced. One carrier sunk on each side, hundreds of aircraft gone, more than 1,600 men dead. But the consequences stretched far beyond the numbers. Japan could not replace her veteran pilots quickly. Her carriers, Shokaku and Zuikaku, would be unavailable for the next operation. A month later, at Midway, that absence would prove decisive. For the Allies, the battle was more than a strategic reprieve. It was a moral victory. Newspapers in Sydney carried headlines, "Allied navies halt Japan." For Australian families who had watched the war creep ever closer, the news brought relief and pride. In the weeks after the battle, survivors reached hospitals in Townsville, Noumea, and Pearl Harbor. Doctors and nurses worked without rest. One surgeon from Lexington's medical team wrote home, "We did what we could." The burns were severe. Many never made it off the table, but those who lived spoke of going back. That kind of spirit, nothing can beat it. Others struggled with quieter wounds. Airmen who had seen their squadrons vanish in the clouds awoke from nightmares for months. Sailors who had drifted among corpses dreamed of open seas they could no longer face. Yet among them ran a current of pride. They had stood firm in the first true test of carrier warfare. As official reports reached Washington and Canberra, analysts studied every detail. Flight paths, bomb hits, radar ranges. The lessons were immediate. Carriers must operate with stronger air patrols. Damage control teams must seal fuel lines faster. Reconnaissance coordination had to improve. The Coral Sea had become a textbook written in blood, and beyond the strategy and data remained the voices. In an oral history recorded years later, Lieutenant Commander John Powers, posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor for his attack on Shokaku, was remembered by his wingman. He dove lower than anyone, right into the guns. His plane hit the deck as the bomb exploded. We watched the flames rise. None of us spoke. We just knew he'd done what had to be done for the Australians. Partnership with the United States now felt unbreakable. The two navies had fought, bled, and won side by side. In Canberra, Prime Minister John Curtin addressed Parliament. "From this day, the defense of Australia and the cause of freedom in the Pacific are one and the same." As the ships returned to port, the surviving crews looked out over the water that had nearly taken them. The Coral Sea was quiet again, its waves erasing all traces of battle. But beneath that calm, the course of the Pacific War had changed. The men who had fought there could not know what lay ahead. Midway, Guadalcanal, the long grind across the islands, all were still to come. Yet the Battle of the Coral Sea had proven something profound, that courage, coordination, and a measure of luck could halt an empire. For the first time, Japan had been stopped. For the first time, the Allies had hope, and in that hope began the long road to victory. The Coral Sea lay quiet again, its swells washing gently over the remnants of war. Oil slicks spread like bruises on the water's surface, the last traces of ships that had once thundered with life. The battle was over, but for the men who fought it, the echoes would last for years. Far from the wreckage, the strategic ripples began to spread. In Tokyo, shock mixed with disbelief. The operation to seize Port Moresby had not merely been delayed, it had failed. Plans to isolate Australia were crumbling. The loss of Shoho, the damage to Shokaku, and the heavy depletion of Zuikaku's air group had shaken confidence within Japan's combined fleet. For the Allies, those same outcomes signaled a turning tide. The Coral Sea had proven that Japan's naval advance could be checked, and that code-breaking, coordination, and air power could change the balance of war. In the headquarters of Admiral Chester Nimitz at Pearl Harbor, the reports arrived in fragments. Lexington lost. Yorktown damaged. Enemy carrier Shoho sunk. Shokaku heavily damaged. Zuikaku surviving but depleted. Port Moresby invasion canceled. Nimitz studied the teletype message in silence. The cost was high, yet for the first time, his staff spoke of momentum shifting westward. In Australia, the impact was deeply personal. The nation had watched Japan's expansion with growing dread. Singapore had fallen in February. Darwin had been bombed in March. Fears of invasion were real. The Battle of the Coral Sea had been fought not just for strategy, but for survival. At naval bases in Sydney, Brisbane, and Fremantle, the news brought quiet celebration. War correspondents described cheering dockworkers and sailors standing together as word of the Japanese withdrawal spread. One Australian seaman, Jack Langrel of HMAS Australia, recalled the moment his ship's radio confirmed the outcome. There wasn't much noise, just a few smiles, a lot of handshakes. Everyone was thinking about the ones who didn't come back, but we knew it meant we'd stop them. Australia was safe, at least for now. Beneath those public reactions, a quieter transformation was taking place. The cooperation between Australian and American forces had forged bonds that would define the rest of the Pacific War. Officers who once hesitated to share information across national lines now worked side by side. Allied command structures began to merge. Airfields across Queensland were turned into joint bases. The war in the Pacific had truly become a shared fight. Behind that coordination stood a hidden group whose work had quietly shaped the entire battle: the codebreakers. At Station Hypo in Pearl Harbor, in Fleet Radio Unit Melbourne, FRU-MEL, in Australia, cryptanalysts had worked tirelessly to break Japanese naval codes, particularly the JN-25B cipher used by the Imperial Japanese Navy. In a small room beneath Melbourne's Albert Park Barracks, Australian and American linguists studied intercepted Japanese signals, parsing them line by line. Among them was a young mathematician, Eric Nave, whose skill at pattern recognition had made him one of Australia's foremost cryptographers. It was Nave's team that first recognized references to an operation targeting MO, the Japanese designation for the Port Moresby offensive. Those decrypts reached Admiral Nimitz in late April 1942. Without them, Task Force 17 would have been in the wrong sea at the wrong time. The Coral Sea was not just a clash of carriers, it was a triumph of intelligence and timing. While the admirals reviewed reports, the survivors returned home. In Pearl Harbor, the rescued crew of USS Lexington disembarked in silence. Many wore borrowed uniforms, their faces were burned, their eyes hollow. They had lost not just a ship, but a home. Sailors called her Lady Lex. Her sinking had cut deep. In hospitals across Hawaii and the U.S. West Coast, nurses tended to survivors pulled from the water. Some suffered severe burns. Others bore shrapnel wounds or shock from hours in fuel-covered seas. A young Navy nurse later recalled, "They came in covered in oil, coughing, barely able to speak. The first thing most of them asked was, 'Did we win?' That's all they wanted to know." In one ward, a sailor from Lexington's engine room, still wrapped in bandages, whispered to a chaplain, "We didn't lose her. She went down fighting. That's different." The wreck of Lexington would rest for decades on the seabed of the Coral Sea, her aircraft still silent on the deck. When explorers finally discovered her in 2018, they found her name still visible beneath layers of silt: USS Lexington. The ocean had preserved her as a memorial. At sea in May 1942, even as rescue ships retrieved the last survivors, the Allied fleet reorganized. Yorktown, though damaged, remained seaworthy. Engineers and deck crews worked day and night to patch her flight deck, restore boilers, and make her ready for what everyone suspected would come next. No one knew then that her next battle, just weeks away, would decide the course of the Pacific War. The Australians, too, were preparing. On the mainland, Royal Australian Air Force squadrons intensified coastal patrols, scanning for any renewed Japanese movement toward New Guinea. The fear that Japan might attempt a new invasion lingered, but Japanese command, stung by the Coral Sea setback, turned its eyes eastward to Midway. For the Allied navies, Coral Sea had revealed more than strategy. It had shown the full power and fragility of the aircraft carrier. The great battleships of the past, once the pride of navies, had fired no shots in the engagement. Instead, aircraft had carried the fight hundreds of miles from their decks. Admirals everywhere took note. The future of naval warfare belonged to the carriers. In Washington, U.S. Navy analysts examined the data. The losses were grim: 69 aircraft destroyed, 543 Americans dead, but they had inflicted even greater damage in return. Most importantly, the Japanese advance toward Australia had been halted. President Roosevelt's message to Prime Minister Curtin spoke plainly. "Your men and ours have struck together with magnificent results. The enemy's plans have been thwarted. Australia stands secure. America stands with you." In Sydney, the Australian War Cabinet met to discuss the broader implications. Curtin understood what the victory meant, not just strategically, but symbolically. Australia had fought alongside the United States in a major naval action and emerged victorious. The partnership was no longer one of convenience. It was destiny. As weeks turned into months, the Battle of the Coral Sea began to take on a deeper meaning for those who had lived through it. Letters home described both pride and pain. In one, a young pilot from Yorktown wrote to his mother, "You'd be proud, Ma. We saw the Shoho go down. I can still see her deck rolling over, planes sliding into the sea. I was scared, but we did our job." I think that's what matters. Others were less certain. Lieutenant James Collins, a surviving dive bomber pilot, recorded in his diary, "I keep hearing the roar of engines and the shouting in the radio. At night I dream of falling, the dive never ending. They call it victory, but all I see are faces we left behind." For historians and naval strategists, the Coral Sea would be dissected endlessly. The operational details became the foundation for future doctrine. The lessons were clear: the importance of radar detection and combat air patrols, the necessity of proper communication between reconnaissance groups, the vulnerability of carriers to internal fires and fuel line explosions, the need for coordination between surface and air units and mixed fleets. Admiral Fletcher's command decisions, often debated, reflected the uncertainties of a new kind of warfare. He had acted on partial intelligence, under fuel constraints, in a vast ocean where weather could conceal entire fleets. Despite criticism, his choices ultimately prevented a Japanese invasion of Port Moresby, an outcome that would have drastically changed the Pacific theater. The Australian naval staff, reviewing Crace's performance, noted the bravery of his surface force, which had faced hours of Japanese air attack without carrier cover. Though they did not engage enemy ships directly, their presence forced Japanese commanders to divert attention and resources, an invisible but vital contribution. Among those who endured those attacks, memories of that day never faded. In one interview decades later, Seaman John Latham of HMAS Hobart recalled, "They came at us out of the sun, dozens of them. We opened up with every gun we had. You could see the tracers curving through the air. When the bombs missed, we cheered. When they hit the water too close, you could feel it in your chest." The Coral Sea was a test of nerve as much as strategy. Crews spent hours at general quarters, sweating in steel compartments, waiting for sirens to sound again. Sleep was scarce, fear was constant, yet morale held. On the American side, the camaraderie forged in those days became legendary. Sailors who had fought together aboard Lexington and Yorktown later served side by side at Midway, Guadalcanal, and the Philippine Sea. Many carried fragments of coral sea wreckage as talismans. Even as the Pacific widened into years of brutal fighting, the Coral Sea remained a reference point, a moment when defeat began to turn toward defiance. In May 1942, the world's headlines were still dominated by Axis victories in Europe. The Allies had lost Singapore, Hong Kong, and the Dutch East Indies. But now, for the first time, a Japanese advance had been stopped cold. For the United States, the psychological effect was profound. For Australia, it was existential. The Coral Sea proved that the Pacific War could be fought and won, not just with numbers or machines, but with coordination, courage, and trust among allies. By the end of May, both sides were already looking ahead. Japan, determined to regain initiative, launched plans for another decisive blow, the attack on Midway. The lessons of Coral Sea were fresh in every admiral's mind. The value of reconnaissance, the vulnerability of carriers, and the need to destroy the enemy before being found. For the men who had fought, however, the battle lived on in dreams, memories, and scars. In the still nights aboard repair ships or hospital cots, many found themselves back in that moment. The roar of engines, the rush of the dive, the explosion of fire across the sea. They could still hear the call sign, Blue 3, diving now. The last words of friends who never returned. They could still see the smoke rising over the horizon where Lady Lex had gone down. The Coral Sea was not only a battle of ships and planes. It was a battle of endurance, courage, and the fragile thread between survival and loss. In time, it would be remembered as the battle that saved Australia, the battle that shaped Midway, and the first step in turning the Pacific tide. But for those who were there, it was something simpler and far more personal. It was the moment when they realized that courage could be louder than fear. The weeks after the battle brought a strange quiet to the Pacific. The waves rolled on, as they always had, indifferent to the wrecks and the men who had vanished beneath them. But far from those calm waters, the consequences of the Coral Sea began to move through every level of the Allied command. At Pearl Harbor, Admiral Nimitz's staff spread maps across long tables, arrows, ranges, and coded designations scattered across the chart. The losses were tallied, but the conclusions were clear. For the first time since December 7, 1941, Japan had failed to take what it sought. The myth of invincibility had cracked. The Allied leadership saw in that crack an opening, small, fragile, but real. If Japan could be stopped once, it could be stopped again. Still, there was no time for celebration. The ocean was vast and war moved quickly. Radio intercepts suggested that Japan was preparing another major operation, one aimed at the Central Pacific. The same codebreakers who had uncovered Operation MO were now deciphering messages about AF. They didn't yet know it, but AF was Midway. For the sailors and airmen who had fought in the Coral Sea, the days that followed felt suspended between exhaustion and anticipation. Yorktown limped back to Pearl Harbor. In her hangar deck, crews worked beside repair parties, patching holes and clearing debris while the ship was still underway. She was battered, her flight deck scorched, but she was alive. And in that survival lay the seeds of Midway's victory to come. When she entered Pearl Harbor, tugboats blew their whistles and dock workers waved. The harbor had not seen a returning carrier since the devastation of December. To the mechanics and welders who began repairs, Yorktown became a symbol. Her survival meant the Navy could still fight. In Sydney, news of the battle's outcome spread slowly. Official communiques were cautious, losses were mentioned briefly, victories described in measured tones. Yet among the people, word of mouth carried the truth faster than any telegram. Australia had been saved. For the first time since the war began, the threat of invasion had receded. In the narrow lanes of Melbourne and Brisbane, sailors in mixed uniforms, Americans in khaki, Australians in blue, shared bars and stories. They spoke of decks aflame, of the eerie calm before the sirens, of comrades lost. And they spoke of something else, respect. They had seen each other fight, bleed, and endure. Whatever differences of accent or training had once existed vanished in the smoke of battle. At the Allied Naval Headquarters in Brisbane, Admiral Herbert Leary sent a message to Nimitz. Australian cooperation exemplary, morale high, joint operations successful. Recommend continued integration of air and sea commands. This single note marked the beginning of what would become one of the most successful alliances in modern history. From the Coral Sea onward, American and Australian forces would plan and fight together as one. Meanwhile, in Japan, the news landed like a stone dropped into still water. Official bulletins described the Coral Sea as a victory. 2 American carriers destroyed, several ships sunk. But inside the Imperial Navy, the truth was known. Shokaku was crippled and under repair at Kure. Zukaku's air group was shattered, its best pilots lost. Admiral Yamamoto, the architect of Japan's naval strategy, understood what that meant. When the next battle came, his carrier force would be weaker. Yet he pressed on. The plan to strike Midway was already in motion. In the Allied world, public reaction to the Coral Sea was cautious pride. Newspapers in London and New York carried small headlines. Allied Navy stopped Japanese advance. First check to the enemy in the Pacific. Few readers understood what that really meant. But among the men at sea, the shift in morale was unmistakable. The ocean that had seemed endless and enemy-owned now felt contested, dangerous but not hopeless. In the weeks after the battle, survivors were interviewed for after-action reports. Their words, preserved in archives at NARA in the Australian War Memorial, form the most human record of the Coral Sea. Lieutenant Harold Bottomley, a dauntless pilot from Yorktown, recalled, "It was all clouds and flashes. You didn't see the ship until the last second. I remember diving and thinking, this is it. When we pulled up, I looked down and saw the carrier burning. I thought, we can win this thing." From HMAS Australia, Seaman Raymond Doyle wrote in a letter home, "When the planes came, the sky turned into a beehive. You could feel the heat of the bullets, but our gunners never flinched. We saw Shoho go under that day. That image will stay with me forever." And from the USS Lexington, survivor Arthur Blake described the chaos below decks. "The power went out, and you could feel the ship dying. We were carrying wounded up ladders in the dark, with the floor hot under our boots. When the captain said abandon ship, it didn't feel like defeat. It felt like mercy." These accounts, gathered years later by historians and archivists, reveal what strategy charts cannot: the fear, confusion, and courage that live inside a battle. Back in Australia, the effects of the Coral Sea extended far beyond the military. Civilians had watched with dread as Japanese forces moved south through the islands. The idea that their cities might be bombed or invaded had become a daily fear. After the battle, for the first time, people spoke of the Japanese being stopped. In schools and churches, prayers of relief replaced prayers for survival. Prime Minister John Curtin addressed the nation in a radio broadcast. "The Allied victory in the Coral Sea is not only a triumph of arms, but a triumph of unity. It has shown that the cooperation of free peoples can turn back aggression." No matter how formidable, his words resonated deeply. The war was still far from over, but the sense of helplessness had lifted. Among military planners, analysis of the Coral Sea's lessons became urgent. The U.S. Navy realized that the era of the battleship was fading. Carriers, once considered vulnerable auxiliaries, had proven decisive. Training programs for naval aviators expanded overnight. New carrier groups were commissioned, and radar technology was refined. At the same time, intelligence services gained new authority. The codebreakers in Hawaii and Melbourne, once working in secrecy and obscurity, were now recognized as indispensable. Their success against Japanese ciphers convinced commanders that information could be as powerful as firepower. For the men of Yorktown, the lesson was more personal. Their ship had survived by the narrowest margin, and they knew they would soon sail again. During her 3-day repair at Pearl Harbor, crewmen worked alongside dockyard laborers, cutting, welding, painting. When word came that Japan was moving toward Midway, many simply nodded. They were ready. The Coral Sea had taught them not to underestimate the enemy and not to despair. It had also shown that victory might demand sacrifice beyond imagination. In later interviews, Admiral Fletcher reflected on the battle with characteristic restraint. It was the first time we fought under those conditions. We were learning as we went. Both sides made mistakes, but we achieved the one thing that mattered most. Port Moresby remained in Allied hands. Historians would later debate Fletcher's caution, his division of forces, and his withdrawal after the loss of Lexington. Yet even his critics conceded that the outcome had been strategically decisive. Japan's expansion had reached its limit. In the months that followed, Allied submarines prowled the routes once used by the Japanese invasion convoys. Air patrols extended from northern Australia deep into the Solomon Islands. The initiative, for the first time, was shifting. Meanwhile, in Japanese war colleges, instructors studied the Coral Sea in silence. They recognized what had happened. Aircraft had replaced artillery. Radio had replaced visual signals. Luck and weather had become as decisive as courage. The coming battles would test every one of those lessons. In personal diaries, Allied sailors captured smaller truths. One American wrote, "I used to think war was noise. Now I know it's mostly waiting. Waiting for the next contact report, waiting for the next launch order, waiting for your luck to run out." An Australian petty officer added simply, "We learned the sea isn't loyal to anyone, but if you fight together, you stand a chance." By late May 1942, the Coral Sea was again a place of silence. The wrecks of Shoho and Lexington rested in the deep, their names carried only by currents and memory. Fishermen in the Solomons spoke of patches of oil that glimmered like glass when the sun hit right. The sea had swallowed the evidence but not the story. In Washington and Canberra, that story became part of the larger Allied narrative. Posters appeared showing U.S. and Australian sailors side by side under the words "Together we fight." Propaganda films used brief, grainy footage of carrier decks, turning the Coral Sea into a symbol of hope. Yet the men who had been there rarely spoke of heroism. They spoke instead of duty, of doing what needed to be done, of keeping faith with the man beside them. In one of his last letters home, an American radio man who had survived Lexington wrote, "If they ask me what I did, tell them I stayed at my post until they told me to go." That's all anyone could do. For those who studied the battle in later years, the Coral Sea represented more than a single victory. It was the hinge of the Pacific War, the point where offensive momentum began to tilt away from Japan. Without it, Port Moresby might have fallen, cutting the lifeline to Australia. Without it, Shokaku and Zuikaku might have joined the strike force at Midway, changing history's course. The men who fought it could not know all that. They knew only that they had faced the best the enemy could offer and survived. As one Australian sailor put it years later, "When people ask what the Coral Sea was about, I tell them it was about not giving up. The rest, the ships, the strategy, that's for historians. For us, it was about holding the line. That line, once drawn across a lonely stretch of ocean, would soon stretch north through Guadalcanal, Tarawa, the Marianas, and all the way to Japan. But it began there, in the Coral Sea, where courage met uncertainty and changed the course of a war." The Coral Sea lay behind them now, its battles fought, its losses counted. But even as the survivors sailed for home, the ripples of that clash spread across the world. The sea was quiet again, yet its silence carried a message that reached from the docks of Sydney to the corridors of Washington and London. For the first time since the war began, the Allies had stopped Japan. It was not a crushing victory. It was not even clear-cut. Both sides had lost ships, men, and aircraft. But strategically, the Coral Sea marked the moment when expansion gave way to resistance, when the Allies proved that Japan's naval power, though formidable, was not invincible. In Tokyo, the shock was quiet but real. The loss of Shoho, the damage to Shokaku, and the exhaustion of Zukaku's air groups forced a reckoning. Japan had planned the Coral Sea operation as the first step in isolating Australia, cutting the lifeline between the Pacific and the Indian Ocean. With Port Moresby unclaimed, that vision faded. The Japanese advance had reached its limit. Admiral Yamamoto, commander-in-chief of the combined fleet, studied the after-action reports in his flagship's cabin. The Coral Sea had cost him valuable aircraft, irreplaceable pilots, and 2 operational carriers. Yet he believed Japan could regain the initiative with one decisive blow. That belief would lead directly to Midway. For the United States, the Coral Sea was more than a tactical success. It was a lifeline of morale. The American public had endured months of grim headlines. Pearl Harbor, the fall of the Philippines, the loss of Singapore. Now, for the first time, came a different kind of story. Newspapers carried photographs of American carriers and Australian cruisers under bold headlines. Japanese checked in the Pacific. Allied navies turned the tide. In Washington, President Franklin D. Roosevelt called it a remarkable achievement of coordination and courage. His address to Congress, brief but powerful, recognized not just the American sailors, but their Australian allies. In the Coral Sea, the forces of liberty have fought side by side and have turned back the tide of conquest. In Australia, those words carried immense weight. The threat of invasion, once a daily fear, began to fade. Families who had dug trenches in their backyards now looked north with cautious confidence. The newspapers in Sydney printed front-page tributes. They saved our shores. America and Australia, brothers in arms. At naval bases in Brisbane, Melbourne, and Perth, sailors from both nations shared quiet toasts. For many Australians, the Coral Sea became more than a military victory. It was personal redemption. Petty Officer William Gorton of HMAS Hobart later recalled, "When we got the word that Port Moresby was safe, the whole ship seemed to breathe again. We'd seen the power of the Japanese Navy up close, but we'd also seen them beaten. That changes something inside you." For the Americans, it was the first test of a new kind of war, a war fought at distances beyond sight, where decisions were made from radar screens and radio reports rather than through the lenses of binoculars. It was a strange modern war, and everyone knew it was only beginning. As ships returned to port, the process of reckoning began. At Pearl Harbor, Admiral Nimitz walked the docks where Yorktown lay under repair. Her decks were scorched, her hull dented by shrapnel, but her crew was alive. In those dents and burns, Nimitz saw something vital: resilience. He told his staff quietly, "They hit us hard, but we're still here, and we'll be ready when they come again." His confidence was not misplaced. Within 72 hours, Navy Yard workers, engineers, and sailors had restored Yorktown to fighting condition. When she sailed out from Midway, welders were still finishing their work below decks. The ship bore scars from the Coral Sea, but they would not slow her down. In the offices of Fleet Radio Unit Melbourne, FRUMEL, the codebreakers who had uncovered Japan's plans for the Coral Sea were already deep into another challenge. They had intercepted fresh communications hinting at a massive operation to the north. The Japanese referred to it as Operation MI. Eric Nave and his American counterparts, working under Commander Rudy Fabian, pored over the decrypts. They found references to AF requiring special preparation. One analyst suggested it might refer to Midway Island. Admiral Nimitz tested the theory by sending a fake message from Midway, claiming that the island's water purification plant had broken down. Within 24 hours, Japanese intelligence reported that AF is short on water. The codebreakers had their answer. The next target was Midway. Without the success of the Coral Sea and the intelligence breakthroughs that made it possible, the U.S. Navy would never have been positioned to meet Japan head-on a month later. The Coral Sea was the rehearsal. Midway would be the performance. Yet while strategists studied maps and decrypts, the emotional toll of the Coral Sea lingered. In hospitals from Hawaii to Townsville, the wounded struggled through long recoveries. Many were scarred for life, their burns a permanent reminder of the inferno aboard Lexington or the strafing runs over Yorktown. One nurse at Pearl Harbor wrote in her diary, "They kept asking about their ships. They wanted to know if Lex was still burning. I told them she went down fighting." That seemed to comfort them. For the families back home, the news came in telegrams marked simply missing or lost at sea. In towns across the United States and Australia, church bells tolled quietly for sailors who would never return. Yet even grief was tempered by pride. The Coral Sea had shown that courage and cooperation could halt even the most powerful enemy. In the months that followed, the battle took on symbolic weight. In Australia, May 4th to May 8th became known as Coral Sea Week. Parades were held, veterans honored, and wreaths laid for the dead. The partnership forged there would never fade. Admiral Halsey later said, "Before the Coral Sea, the enemy looked 10 feet tall. After it, we saw he could bleed." For historians, that simple truth defined the battle's legacy. While the Coral Sea did not produce a clear victor, it produced something far more important: balance. It reset the scales of war in the Pacific. The Japanese Navy, though still powerful, could no longer operate with impunity. Every operation from then on would require caution, calculation, and fear of Allied interception. In Japan, reports of the battle were tightly censored. Newspapers announced a great victory, claiming 2 American carriers sunk. But among the naval staff, the truth spread quickly. Admiral Takagi's after-action report described heavy losses and the exhaustion of flight crews. It concluded with a quiet warning: enemy resistance is increasing in strength and skill. Our pilots face experienced opposition. Replacement of personnel will require time. Time was a luxury Japan did not have. At Allied command centers, the lessons of Coral Sea were already shaping doctrine. Carrier groups were now trained to operate in coordinated task forces with overlapping air cover. New anti-aircraft weapons were fitted, and damage control training intensified. Every sailor who had survived the Coral Sea became a teacher to those who followed. In Melbourne, Rear Admiral Crace addressed his men aboard HMAS Australia. "We proved that our ships, our crews, and our allies can meet any challenge. We have stood together under fire, and we will again." The Coral Sea had not just altered the course of strategy, it had changed people. It had hardened young men into veterans, replaced fear with determination, and turned uncertainty into resolve. For the civilians who lived through those weeks of tension, memory blurred with myth. They remembered the radio broadcasts, the newspaper headlines, the faces of sailors returning home. To them, the Coral Sea became not just a battle, but a symbol of salvation. In time, that symbolism would cross generations. Decades later, when veterans gathered in Sydney and Townsville to mark anniversaries, they did so side by side with their American counterparts. The Coral Sea had bound 2 nations together in friendship. In 1968, the U.S. ambassador to Australia said during a memorial service, "The Coral Sea is where our 2 nations met as equals, fought as brothers, and forged a bond that is never broken." He was right. Even today, when American warships enter Sydney Harbor, they are greeted by crowds waving both flags. Back in 1942, those friendships were forged in the crucible of fire. On the morning of May 8th, as Lexington burned, sailors from Yorktown and Morris pulled survivors from the sea. Oil-slicked, exhausted, they passed cigarettes between them, sharing the silence that comes only after battle. One survivor, Chief Petty Officer Bill Jenkins, later said, "We didn't know their names, didn't know where they were from, but we knew they were ours. That was enough." The Coral Sea ended not with victory parades or fanfare, but with quiet determination. It was a beginning more than an end, a prologue to Midway, to Guadalcanal, to the long road across the Pacific. and yet its importance can never be overstated. It was the first time in history that a major naval battle was fought entirely by aircraft. The opposing fleets never saw each other. It marked the birth of a new kind of warfare, one that would define the rest of the 20th century. But more than that, it was a human story of sailors facing fire and flood, of code breakers piecing together meaning from intercepted fragments, of nations discovering strength in unity. For the men who fought it, the Coral Sea would always be a place of ghosts. When they closed their eyes, they could still see the sky thick with planes, the sea streaked with smoke, the horizon glowing red at dusk. Yet amid those memories was pride, the knowledge that they had stood firm when the world's future seemed most uncertain. As one American officer wrote after the battle, "It wasn't about winning or losing. It was about holding on long enough for hope to find us." The battle had ended. The guns fell silent. The ocean swallowed the flames and smoke, leaving only oil slicks drifting under the sun. The Battle of the Coral Sea was over, but its shadow would stretch far into the years ahead. In the quiet that followed, fleets returned to port. Wounded men filled hospital wards, and telegrams traveled across oceans bearing news that changed families forever. Yet behind every number and headline lay something far greater, a shift in the course of the Pacific War and in the story of the free world. For Japan, the Coral Sea was the first hard lesson in limitation. For the Allies, it was proof that determination and cooperation could rewrite what once seemed inevitable. The sea itself offered no monuments. There were no graves, no markers, no flags fluttering above the deep. The men who died there belonged to the water now, their ships, their tombs, their courage, their memorial. But in the halls of command and in the hearts of those who survived, the meaning of that battle grew clearer with each passing week. At Pearl Harbor, Admiral Nimitz reviewed the after-action reports. He saw the tactical mistakes, the misidentifications, the fuel shortages, the communications lost in static. But he also saw something extraordinary: the courage of crews who had fought without hesitation, the precision of pilots who faced overwhelming odds, and the promise of a fleet learning, adapting, and rising from defeat. He turned to his staff and said simply, "We didn't lose the Coral Sea. We found ourselves there." That discovery came at a cost. One carrier sunk, one damaged, hundreds of men gone. But the victory lay not in the balance sheet, it lay in momentum. The Japanese advance across the Pacific had been halted for the first time. The invasion of Port Moresby was canceled. The southern lifeline between the United States and Australia remained open. The entire strategic plan of the Japanese Imperial Navy, its drive to isolate Australia and dominate the Pacific Rim, was broken. Without realizing it, the men who fought in the Coral Sea had set the stage for Midway. Shokaku lay crippled in dry dock. Zuikaku's flight decks were intact, but her squadrons were decimated. Their absence would leave Admiral Yamamoto short of 2 carriers in the coming battle, a disadvantage from which the Japanese Navy would never recover. A month later, in June 1942, Yorktown, patched and repaired in record time, would sail into the waters near Midway and help deliver one of the most decisive victories in naval history. In that sense, the Coral Sea was the rehearsal for triumph, the battle that made Midway possible. But for the men who lived it, those grand consequences were far away. What they remembered were moments: the deafening roar of engines as the first planes launched, the shudder of a ship struck by a torpedo, the blinding flash of fire that turned day into night, the quiet after the last explosion when only the sea remained. Sailors spoke of the smell of oil and salt, of the heat that seared their faces, of comrades pulled from burning water. They spoke of the stillness that came when the fight was done, a silence filled with both relief and loss. In the words of Lieutenant George Cornish, a Yorktown navigator, recorded years later, "When you're up there, you don't think about strategy, you think about getting home. But after, when it's all over, you start to realize what it meant. We stopped them." We actually stopped them. In Australia, that realization struck deeply. For months, citizens had lived under the threat of invasion. Families had been urged to prepare evacuation routes. Blackout curtains were hung in every city. When news spread that the Japanese fleet had turned back, it felt as though the entire nation had exhaled. In a speech broadcast from Canberra, Prime Minister John Curtin spoke directly to the people. Let us remember the men who fought in the Coral Sea, not only for their own countries, but for all free peoples. Their victory is our safety, their courage, our inspiration. The words echoed in homes and schools across Australia. In Brisbane, children drew chalk maps of the Coral Sea on classroom floors, tracing the routes of Allied ships. In Sydney, mothers pinned photographs of American sailors beside their own sons' portraits. The bond between Australia and the United States, forged in the heat of battle, became unbreakable. In the months that followed, American airfields rose along Australia's northern coast. Joint training exercises became routine. The two nations fought side by side across New Guinea, the Solomons, and beyond. For many Australians, the Coral Sea was the beginning of an enduring friendship, one that would outlast the war. Years later, Admiral Halsey would say of his Australian counterparts, "We came as allies, and we left as brothers." The human cost, though, never faded. Survivors carried it in their memories, in their dreams, in the long silences that followed when they spoke of the war. Sailors who had escaped Lexington often described the same vision. Looking back across the water to see their ship burning, the flames rising into the sky like a final salute. One of them, Petty Officer Charles Hunt, said quietly, "We called her Lady Lex. Watching her go down was like losing someone you loved." For many, the sea itself became a graveyard of memories. Every visit to the coast, every sound of a gull or a wave, brought back that moment when fire met water and men were changed forever. In the United States, the Navy built new carriers to replace those lost. The names of the fallen ships were given to their successors: Lexington, CV-16, Yorktown, CV-10, so that the spirit of those who fought would sail again. At the launch of the new Lexington in 1943, a crowd gathered at Quincy, Massachusetts. As the ship slid down the slipway into the water, a single survivor of the original carrier stood among them. When asked how he felt, he answered, "It's like seeing an old friend come home." The Coral Sea also changed the way wars would be remembered. It marked the end of an era, the last time great fleets went to battle without ever sighting each other. The engagement proved that courage no longer required physical proximity. A pilot in the clouds could be as decisive as a gunner at a turret. War had entered a new dimension, and the Coral Sea had drawn the blueprint. In universities and naval academies, the battle became a study in innovation. In homes and hearts, it became a story of courage. The years passed. The men who had fought grew old. Ships that once roared across the Pacific became museum relics, their decks quiet except for the footsteps of visitors. Yet the memory of the Coral Sea endured. Every May, veterans gathered in Sydney and Townsville, in Pearl Harbor and Washington. They stood together, Americans and Australians, and remembered the days when the sea burned and history turned. They remembered not just victory, but sacrifice. At one such ceremony, an old sailor laid a wreath and whispered to the younger ones beside him, "You don't fight for glory. You fight so that someday someone else won't have to." In 2018, when deep-sea explorers found the wreck of USS Lexington resting nearly 2 miles below the surface, the world caught its breath. There she was, her hull intact, her name still visible in white letters. Aircraft lay scattered across her deck, perfectly preserved in the cold darkness. One still bore the painted emblem of the Flying Dragon Squadron, a coiled serpent ready to strike. Admiral Harry Harris, himself the son of a Coral Sea veteran, said upon the discovery, "She's finally been found, but she was never lost. Her spirit has been with us all along. That spirit remains the true legacy of the Coral Sea." It was not a war for conquest, but for connection, for defending what was human against what was cruel, for standing together when the world seemed to be falling apart. The Allied sailors and airmen who fought there were not seeking glory. They were trying to hold a line, an invisible line drawn across the Pacific between tyranny and freedom, and they held it. From that line, the world would move forward, through Midway, Guadalcanal, Leyte Gulf, and finally to peace. The Coral Sea became the first great answer to the darkness that had swept across the oceans. And when the war ended and the guns were silent for good, the friendship born there remained. Today, when American ships visit Australian waters, when sailors from both nations stand side by side in remembrance, they do so in the shadow of that same battle, a battle fought not for territory, but for tomorrow. As historians write, as generations learn, one truth endures. The Battle of the Coral Sea was not won by ships or planes alone. It was won by courage, by cooperation, by faith between allies, and by men who believed that even in the darkest storm, the light of freedom could still be seen across the waves. The Coral Sea lies calm now, its depths holding the remains of heroes, its surface reflecting the skies they once fought beneath. And as long as the waves move, their story moves with them, because history, like the sea, never truly sleeps. It only waits to be remembered.